The shovel bit into the earth with a sound like a dull tooth. Elias shifted his weight, driving the steel blade down with the worn heel of his boot, leveraging another mound of damp black soil onto the growing pile. Beside the hole, a large, brindled dog with intelligent amber eyes watched him, tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the packed ground. The dog, Boro, had been his sole companion for the 3 months since the funeral, a silent witness to the quiet dismantling of one life and the laborious construction of another. Elias was 19, and the cabin his grandfather had built was now his, along with 40 acres of unforgiving mountain land that cared little for his grief. The hole was already 8 feet deep and 12 feet square, its walls shored up with rough-hewn timbers. He was digging it not next to the cabin, but directly into the slight rise of the hill against which the cabin's back wall was set. He intended to break through the foundation, to connect this subterranean space to the small cellar. That's the craziest thing I've ever seen a man do to a perfectly good foundation. Elias didn't look up. He knew the voice. Mr. Gable lived on the next ridge over, a man whose hands were maps of 60 years of hardship and whose opinions were as solid and unmovable as the granite bedrock. Elias finished his shovelful, straightened his back with a soft grunt, and wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty glove. Boro's tail stopped thumping. The dog raised his head, a low rumble in his chest. "Easy, boy," Elias said, his voice quiet. He finally turned to face his neighbor. Mr. Gable stood at the edge of the tree line, arms crossed over his plaid wool shirt. "Tornado room," Elias said. It was explanation enough. Gable let out a short, barking laugh that didn't hold any humor. "A tornado room? Up here? Son, we're at 4,000 feet. We get wind that'll peel the shingles off your roof, sure, but twisters? That's flatland foolishness. Your granddaddy was from the plains, wasn't he? Some ideas don't travel well." He knew what he was doing, Elias stated. He turned back to his work, the conversation for him concluded. "You're inviting the damp in, is what you're doing," Gable pressed on, stepping closer. "You're undermining the house. That back wall will settle, crack clean in two. Come the first big freeze, the frost heave will buckle this whole pit and likely your cellar with it. What are you thinking, boy?" Elias paused again, leaning on the shovel. He looked at the hole, then at the cabin, then at the sky. He thought of his grandfather's journal, the pages filled with spidery script, diagrams of airflow, and notes on thermal mass. "I have a plan." "A plan?" Gable scoffed, shaking his head. He walked around the perimeter of the excavation, kicking at a loose clod of dirt. "I see a plan for ruin. Your father, bless his soul, he had common sense. He knew how to listen to his elders. This is something else. This is stubbornness looking for a place to happen." Elias said nothing. He simply went back to digging. The rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel was his only reply. After another minute of watching, Gable gave another dismissive snort and walked away, his heavy boots crunching on fallen leaves. Boro watched him go, then nudged his head against Elias's leg, a silent reassurance. Elias reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears, his calloused fingers finding the familiar soft spot. The sun was beginning to dip below the ridgeline, painting the sky in strokes of orange and bruised purple. He had a few more hours of light. The work was not done. Weeks turned into a month. The hole was finished, its floor lined with a thick bed of crushed stone he'd hauled by wheelbarrow from the creek bed, 170 trips in total. Now he was laying the walls, not with wood, but with stone. He used the field stone he cleared from the small pasture every spring, just as his father and grandfather had done. They had piled it along the fence line, a long, meandering wall of forgotten labor. Now, Elias was giving it purpose. He had his grandfather's sledge and chisels, and he spent his days splitting the larger boulders, shaping them into rough, manageable blocks. Each one weighed between 50 and 80 pounds. He would lift one, settle it into the wheelbarrow, and push it to the pit. The muscles in his back and shoulders burned with a constant, deep ache. His hands were a wreck of blisters that had hardened into thick calluses, which then split and bled and hardened again. One afternoon, as he was wrestling a particularly stubborn piece of granite into place, he saw someone watching him from the path that led to town. It was Anna, the storekeeper's daughter. She wasn't laughing or pointing. She just stood there, a basket resting on her hip, her expression one of genuine curiosity. Boro, who usually barked at strangers, simply watched her, his tail giving a tentative wag. Elias, feeling the heat rise in his neck, focused on his work, setting the stone and checking its level. He could feel her gaze on him, a different kind of weight than the stones. Finally, she walked closer, stopping a polite distance from the pit. "Hello, Elias." He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Anna." "Mr. Gable says you're building a tornado room," she said, her tone neutral, inquisitive. "I am," he confirmed, grabbing his trowel and slapping a thick layer of mortar onto the stone. "He says it will ruin your house." He's wrong. The statement was flat, without anger or arrogance. It was a simple fact, as solid as the stones he was setting. She peered into the hole, at the meticulously laid courses of rock. "It looks strong." "It will be." She lingered for a moment longer. "My father has a new shipment of nails in, if you need any, and some of that good tar for sealing." "I'll need tar," he said, finally meeting her eyes. They were the color of moss after a rain. "Thank you." She smiled, a small, genuine thing that made the ache in his back lessen for a moment. "I'll tell him to set some aside for you." She continued on her way, and Elias watched her go until she disappeared around the bend. He went back to his work, but the rhythm felt different now. Lighter. He broke through the cabin's thick stone foundation in late September. It was a slow, brutal process, chipping away with a star drill and a sledgehammer, the shock of each blow traveling up his arms. When the hole was finally large enough, a rectangle of darkness connecting the new room to the old cellar, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. He was not destroying, he was connecting. The next phase of the plan was the one that had earned him the most ridicule. He began hauling clay from the creek bank, mixing it with straw and water in a great wooden trough. He packed this mixture, a dense cob, into the 8-inch gap between the stone walls of the new room and the earthen walls of the pit. It was insulation, his grandfather's journal had explained. Earth and stone held the cold, but this mixture of clay and straw would hold the warmth. Mr. Sterling, who owned the timber mill and half the town besides, had driven his new motor car up the lane to watch the spectacle. He'd stood there in his clean city clothes, a gold watch chain glinting on his vest. "What in God's name is that?" Sterling had asked, gesturing with his cigar at the mud-caked Elias. "Insulation," Elias had answered, not breaking his rhythm of packing the cob into the wall. "It's mud and grass, son. You're building yourself a mud dauber's nest. You know what happens to mud when it freezes? It cracks. It turns to dust. You'd be better off stuffing it with newspaper." "This will work," Elias had said, his voice low and even. "Suit yourself," Sterling had chuckled, climbing back into his car. "Don't come to me for a loan when you have to rebuild this whole wall come spring. Some new ideas are just old mistakes in disguise." The car had rumbled away, leaving behind the smell of gasoline and derision. Elias had kept working, packing the damp, heavy cob until his fingers were raw and the sun had set. He worked by lantern light, Boro a sleeping shadow at his feet. The final, most peculiar part of the construction involved two large ceramic pipes. He laid one running from the floor of the new room, angling it deep into the earth for nearly 30 feet, far away from the cabin. This was the fresh air intake. The journal claimed the earth itself would warm the frigid winter air as it was drawn through the pipe, from a potential 0 degrees to nearly 50 by the time it entered the room. The second pipe was the exhaust, running from the ceiling up through the cabin's original chimney, nestled beside the main flue for the wood stove. The rising heat from the stovepipe, the journal promised, would create a constant, gentle draw, pulling the fresh, geothermally warmed air into the room and expelling the stale air. A passive system. No moving parts, nothing to break. He finished the roof last, a thick slab of reinforced concrete he'd mixed by hand, bag after bag, until his arms felt like lead. He poured it 6 inches thick, then covered it with a waterproof membrane of hot tar that he'd bought from Anna's father. Finally, he'd spent a week hauling the excavated earth back, covering the concrete roof until it was buried under 4 feet of soil, seamlessly rejoining the hill it was built into. From the outside, when the grass grew back, it would be invisible. The only sign of its existence was a small, stone-lined ventilation shaft for the intake pipe, capped with a grate 100 feet away on the hillside. By the first week of November, it was done. The connection to the cellar was sealed with a heavy, insulated oak door he'd built himself. The room itself was stark and simple. Stone walls, a smooth concrete floor, and the 2 pipe openings. It smelled of damp earth, mortar, and clay. It was utterly silent. He lit a lantern and stood in the center of the room, Boro at his side. He placed a thermometer on a small shelf he'd built into the wall. Outside, the temperature was dropping, a sharp autumn chill promising the winter to come. The thermometer inside read 54 degrees. The first snows came a week later, a light dusting that melted by noon. But the cold stayed. The nights grew longer, and the wind developed a mean, cutting edge. The men gathered at the general store spoke of the winter ahead. The squirrels were frantic, the old-timers said. The woolly bear caterpillars had thick coats. It was going to be a hard one. The talk would occasionally turn to Elias and his folly. "That boy's hole is probably a block of ice by now," Gable would say, warming his hands by the pot-bellied stove. "A crying shame," Mrs. Gable would add, her voice full of genuine, if misplaced, concern. "His poor mother would be heartbroken to see him working himself to the bone on such nonsense. He'll catch his death of cold in that damp pit." Elias heard the whispers when he went to town for supplies. He saw the pitying looks, the headshakes. He bought his flour and salt, a new whetstone, and the tar Anna's father had saved for him, and said nothing. He simply nodded to his neighbors, loaded his wagon, and headed back up the mountain, Boro trotting faithfully behind. He spent his days chopping and stacking firewood, enough for 2 winters, his axe falling in a steady, relentless rhythm. He repaired the roof of the barn, chinked the logs of the cabin, and hunted, curing the meat for the long months ahead. He prepared. Inside the cabin, he kept the wood stove burning low. But he spent most of his evenings down in the new room. He'd brought down a comfortable chair, a small table, and a kerosene lamp. Boro would curl up on a thick wool blanket at his feet. While the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes of the cabin above, the subterranean room remained still and quiet. The temperature never wavered. Day after day, as the outside world plunged deeper into the cold, the thermometer on the wall held steady. 54 degrees, sometimes 55 if he'd been working in the room, his body heat adding to the ambient warmth. It was not hot, but it was a constant, livable warmth that required no fuel, no fire, just the deep, steady heat of the earth itself. One evening, a particularly vicious wind was scouring the mountainside. Elias sat in his chair, reading one of his grandfather's old books by lamplight. Boro was asleep, twitching occasionally as he chased dream rabbits. The silence in the room was a physical presence, a shield against the storm's fury. He could feel the vibrations of the wind through the tons of earth and stone around him, but he could not hear it. He thought of Mr. Gable in his drafty farmhouse, stuffing rags into the window frames. He thought of Mr. Sterling in his big, elegant house, burning through cords of expensive, seasoned hardwood just to keep the chill at bay. They had laughed. He closed his book and listened to the profound quiet. He was not laughing either. He was just warm. He was ready. The winter of 1923 did not arrive. It descended. It fell from the sky not as snow, but as a solid wall of white. An Arctic hurricane born over the frozen plains of Canada and driven south with a fury that felt personal, malevolent. The old-timers called it the Great White Hurricane, a blizzard that would become the benchmark against which all other storms were measured for the next 100 years. It began on a Tuesday in mid-January. Elias had been outside splitting the last of a large oak round when he noticed the sky. It was a strange, bruised yellow-gray, and the air had gone unnervingly still. Boro, who was usually chasing chips of wood, stood with his nose to the wind, a low whine escaping his throat. Elias paused, axe in hand, and listened. There was nothing to hear but the strange, heavy silence. He had read about this in his grandfather's journal, the calm before. He left the oak where it lay, gathered his tools, and secured the barn door with a heavy iron pin. He checked the livestock, 2 cows and a handful of chickens, ensuring their water was fresh and their feed was topped off. He brought an extra 4 buckets of water into the cabin, filling the reservoir on the wood stove and a large basin besides. Then he went down into the winter room, taking Boro with him, and sealed the heavy oak door. Within an hour, the wind came. It was not a howl. It was a physical scream, a solid presence that slammed into the little cabin. Upstairs he could hear the sound of it, a deafening, continuous roar. But down in the earth it was muted, a distant, angry rumble. He lit the kerosene lamp, its gentle hiss a comforting counterpoint to the storm's rage. The thermometer on the wall read 54 degrees. Boro lay by the door, his ears perked, but he was not afraid. He trusted Elias. He trusted the room. The snow began to fall, thick and heavy, like granulated sugar pouring from a torn sack. For 3 days, it did not stop. For 3 days, the sun did not shine. The world outside the cabin was reduced to a roaring, blinding whiteness. Elias only went upstairs to tend the fire in the wood stove, keeping it burning just enough to prevent the pipes from freezing and to look out the windows. On the first day, he could see the tree line. On the second, he could only see the fence posts. By the third day, he could see nothing. The snow had drifted up past the windowsills, burying the cabin's first floor. The light that filtered in was a dim, eerie blue. The wind had sculpted the snow into drifts 20 feet high, burying his woodpile, the path to the barn, everything. He was sealed in. Yet, in his subterranean sanctuary, life was calm. He ate the cured meat and hardtack he had stored. He read his books. He cleaned his rifle. He talked to Boro, his quiet words swallowed by the stone walls. The air remained fresh, drawn through the long underground pipe, and the temperature remained constant. He was not merely surviving, he was living, waiting out the storm in a pocket of stillness carved from the heart of the mountain. On the 4th day, the wind died. The silence that followed was as profound as the previous roar. When Elias forced open the main cabin door, he was met with a solid wall of snow. He had to use a shovel to tunnel his way out, emerging into a transformed world. The landscape was gone, replaced by a rolling, alien desert of white under a brilliantly clear, cold sky. The air was so frigid it burned his lungs. His thermometer outside the door registered 20 degrees below zero. He tunneled his way to the barn, the effort leaving him breathless. The animals were safe, their body heat having kept the small space from freezing solid. He was checking the barn roof for damage when he saw the first sign of another human being. It was a figure, struggling through the massive drifts, moving with a desperate, exhausted slowness. As it drew closer, he recognized the shape of Mr. Gable. He was not wearing a proper coat, only a thick sweater, and his face was pale, his lips blue. "Elias," Gable gasped, collapsing against the side of the barn. "Thank God. The fire went out. We ran out of wood 2 days ago. The drifts buried the pile. We've been burning furniture, the chairs, the table, but it's all gone now. Martha, she's not good." Elias didn't hesitate. "Get inside," he said, his voice firm. He helped the older man into the relative warmth of the barn, then turned and began breaking a trail back toward the Gable homestead. It took him nearly an hour to cover the half-mile, the snow at times up to his chest. The Gable house was like a tomb. The air inside was colder than the air outside, it seemed, stagnant and deadly. Mrs. Gable was huddled in a bed, buried under a mountain of blankets, her breathing shallow. She was barely conscious. "We have to move her," Elias said. He found a small wooden sled used for hauling firewood and, with Mr. Gable's help, gently moved the frail woman onto it. The journey back was a nightmare. Elias pulled, his legs burning, his lungs on fire, while Mr. Gable pushed from behind. Boro ran ahead, barking, as if to clear a path that wasn't there. When they finally stumbled back into Elias's cabin, the contrast was staggering. The air upstairs was cold, as he'd only kept the stove on low, but it was not the life-threatening freeze of the Gable home. He led them immediately to the heavy oak door and opened it. A wave of stable, gentle warmth washed over them. Mr. Gable stopped, his mouth agape. He looked from the simple, stone-walled room to Elias, his eyes wide with disbelief. How is it warm?" "Geothermal," Elias said simply. "The earth. Come." He helped carry Mrs. Gable down the short flight of steps and laid her on his own cot. He covered her with his thickest wool blankets and put a hot water bottle, warmed on the wood stove, at her feet. For the first time in 2 days, a flicker of life returned to her eyes. She let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. Mr. Gable stood in the center of the room, turning in a slow circle. He touched the stone wall. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was neutral, holding the temperature of the deep earth. He looked at the thermometer, 54 degrees. Outside, it was 20 below. He finally looked at Elias, and the old man's face, etched with a lifetime of certainty, crumpled. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool, an old, stubborn fool. You saved our lives." "You're safe now," Elias said. He went upstairs to make broth. They were not the last. Before nightfall, 2 more families had made their way to Elias's cabin. The Sterlings arrived last. The big man's fine house, with its large, single-pane windows, had become an icebox. His furnace had failed, and his servants had fled. He arrived with his wife and 2 young children, his face a mask of humbled desperation. He did not say a word as Elias led his family down into the crowded but warm room, a space he had publicly mocked as a mud dauber's nest. He simply found a corner, sat his family down, and covered his face with his hands. For a week, Elias's cabin became an ark. 15 people and 1 dog shared the space. They slept in shifts, sharing the cots and blankets. Elias made endless trips to the barn, rationing the feed and water for his animals, and brought back milk from the cows. He shared his stores of cured meat, flour, and potatoes. In the small, warm room, the barriers of wealth and age and pride dissolved. Mr. Sterling, the mill owner, helped a tenant farmer's wife soothe her crying baby. Mrs. Gable, recovering her strength, told stories to the Sterling children. They were no longer neighbors, they were survivors. And they all looked at the quiet young man who had made it possible with a new kind of reverence. When the thaw finally came and the rescue parties from the town below finally broke through, they found the small cluster of survivors at the Elias cabin safe and well. The story spread like wildfire. The boy they had called a fool, the stubborn loner with his flatland ideas, had built a room that had saved them. He had listened not to the noisy opinions of men, but to the quiet wisdom of the earth. The following summer, Mr. Gable appeared at Elias's property, not to mock, but to ask for help. He held a worn, dog-eared journal in his hands. "My boy," he said, his voice full of a respect he had never shown before. "Would you teach me?" Elias took the journal. It was a cheap ledger, empty. He opened it to the first page and with a piece of charcoal began to draw. He drew a square for the room, lines for the pipes, and explained the principles of thermal mass and passive ventilation. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not ask for an apology. He simply shared the knowledge. That summer, Elias helped Gable build his own winter room. The next summer, 3 more families came to him. Mr. Sterling, who had lost a fortune in timber that winter, paid Elias a handsome sum to oversee the construction of winter rooms for all his tenant farmers, insisting on the finest materials. Elias accepted the work, but when he was done, he used the money to buy a new bull for the Gables, whose livestock had perished in the storm. Anna came by often that summer, bringing him cool water as he worked, or a loaf of fresh bread from her mother's oven. She would sit with him in the evenings, on the porch of the small cabin, and they would watch the sun set over the mountains. She never talked about the storm, or the room, or how he had been proven right. She talked about the wildflowers on the ridge, or a book she was reading. She listened to the quiet spaces he left between his words, and seemed to understand them better than anyone. They were married the following autumn, in a simple ceremony by the creek. Years passed. The winters came and went, some harsh, some mild, but the great white hurricane was never repeated. Yet, the memory of it lingered. The winter rooms, once called Elias's Folly, became known as safety cellars, or simply winter dens. Nearly every home on the mountain had one, each built from the principles Elias had learned from his grandfather's journal. He never refused a request for help, never asked for payment beyond the cost of materials. His payment was seeing the quiet confidence in his neighbor's eyes as the first snows of the season began to fall. Boro grew old. His brindle muzzle turned gray, and his amber eyes clouded with age. He moved slower, his joints stiff, but he never left Elias's side. He would lie on the porch, his head on his paws, watching Elias work in the garden, or follow him slowly down to the barn. One cool autumn morning, 14 years after the great storm, Elias found him lying in his favorite spot of sun on the porch, still and peaceful. He had died in his sleep. Elias buried him on the hill overlooking the cabin, under a tall pine tree, and carved his name into a smooth river stone. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the stone, the silence deeper and emptier than it had ever been before. Anna and Elias had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who grew up in the small cabin, playing in the fields where their father had once cleared stones. They learned his quiet ways, his patience, and his respect for the old knowledge. Elias taught his son how to read the sky, how to use an axe, how to lay a stone wall that would stand for a century. He taught his daughter how to identify the herbs in the forest, how to preserve food for the winter, how to stitch a wound closed. He gave them his grandfather's journal, its pages now soft and frayed with use, and told them it was more valuable than gold. As he grew older, Elias's hands became gnarled like oak roots, his back bent from a lifetime of labor. But his eyes remained clear and sharp. He became the elder he had once defied, a repository of quiet wisdom for the community. Young couples, building their first homes, would come to him for advice. He would walk their land, feel the soil in his hands, and show them the best place to dig, the best way to orient their house to the sun and the wind. He spoke in the same short, declarative sentences he always had, but now people listened with rapt attention. He outlived Mr. Gable and even Mr. Sterling. He watched his children have children of their own. On his 75th birthday, the whole community gathered at his homestead for a celebration. They ate and drank and told stories, and speaker after speaker stood up to thank him. They didn't just thank him for saving them during the great storm. They thanked him for changing the way they lived, for teaching them a deeper, more resilient way to be. Elias sat on his porch, Anna's hand in his, and simply nodded, a small, quiet smile on his face. He passed away in his sleep one night, in the bed he had shared with his wife for over 50 years. It was a mild winter, and the cabin was warm. His son found him in the morning, his face peaceful. They buried him on the hill next to Boro, under the same tall pine. His gravestone was a single large piece of granite, taken from the same fields where he had gathered the stones for his winter room. The epitaph was simple, carved by his son, using the very chisels Elias had inherited from his own grandfather. It did not list dates or accomplishments. It said only, Elias. He had a plan. It worked. Decades later, long after the faces and names of the people he had saved were forgotten, the structures remained. Hikers and historians, studying the old mountain settlements, would note the peculiar architectural feature of the region, the small, sturdy, subterranean rooms connected to the old cabins. They were remarkably well preserved, their stone walls unbowed, the air inside still holding a stable, earthen coolness in the summer and a relative warmth in the winter. They were monuments of stone and earth, testaments not to a single act of heroism, but to a long, patient life of quiet persistence. They were proof that sometimes the most radical idea is simply to listen to the earth, and that the loudest truths are often spoken in the deepest silence. The original cabin still stood, its back settled comfortably into the hill, anchored and made stronger by the invisible room that lay buried beneath the soil, a silent, enduring legacy.